one of my favorite memories about being in Alaska was all the services, sometimes in conjunction with Canadian forces, would go out on an exercise in the Delta River Basin, the floodplain, up in the middle of the state, kind of west of Fairbanks. Usually it was in the winter, and be a month-long exercise. So you're in the boonies for a month. And the one that particularly sticks in my memory was Brimfrost. Brimfrost was the name of the exercise, 1983. And I'll try to inject a little history here as I go. So I was in a combat engineer company. So in conflict, there would be combat infantry troops in first to clear and hold a perimeter, and then we would come in right behind them and construct an airbase or airstrip, set up supplies, roads in and out, that kind of stuff. And so for this exercise, they held the exercise as though it was an actual event. And so they staged it just like they would if something happened. And so we were one of the first units in there. And for the first week that we were there, it ranged between 40 and about 75 degrees below zero for a week, for a solid week. Some of the cool things about that were that the only way to get from the highway to where the training field was to cross the river delta. And it was just an enormous river that spreads out in a big alluvial plain where it's trying to get out to the ocean. And we would come to the staging area and go out and drill holes and pump water up on top, and it would freeze, and drill holes, pump water up on top over and over and over until the ice was thick enough in a path that was strong enough as a bridge for the vehicles to go across. I'm talking about 10-ton or 10-yard dumps with fully loaded trailers and huge fuel trucks and tractor trailers with dozers and all excavators on them, a lot of weight. And so we did that to get across there. And during that week that it was so cold, none of those vehicles were ever turned off, because if you turned them off, maybe they might be okay for half an hour or so, but a couple hours off and they'd freeze up. They wouldn't start again.
Sure.
And so it was just a matter of living in a constant diesel fog in the woods, right? Which wasn't terribly pleasant. But just the experience of physically being in an environment that was that extreme, where the temperature could literally kill you if you didn't take care of yourself and weren't aware of what you were doing, was one of the things that I look back on with pride.
Welcome to How I Embraced the Suck, a podcast where you get to hear from veterans what life in the military is really like. I am your host, Walt, and before we start, you should know that I do not censor the show in any way. You have been warned. All right, well, today we have with us Delton, who's former military, former Army, and was in Alaska, and that is about all I know. So I'm going to learn right along with you guys. Delton, how's it going?
Good.
Thanks for being on. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
It's a time commitment, and I don't take it lightly. So thanks.
Well, it's thinking about getting ready for this, made me go back and examine all those memories, and it not a lot of them do I think about on a daily basis. So it was a good mental trip too for me to go back and dredge all that up. So.
Back to the Spanish Civil War times.
Not quite that far back.
So kind of give an overview of your time in.
Okay.
And then we'll jump back and hit it from the beginning.
Okay. So I spent a total of 3 years and 4 months and some odd days in, starting in January of 81, got out in May of 84, 85, did I say? I can't remember now. And then 3 years after that of inactive reserve, which really doesn't mean anything. I guess what it meant was if the country went to war or something, they could have called up the inactive if they exhausted the active reserves. So
sure.
Military life for me was it was a grab bag. a lot of different emotions, a lot of different impacts on me. To go back a little bit and explain why I decided to join.
Yeah.
I was raised in a very conservative Mennonite family. My father and both grandfathers were all Mennonite preachers. And I have 4 siblings, and at one point, all 5 of us children kind of rebelled against our parents' religion and rejected and went off and did our own things,
Sure.
right? And for me, we happened to be living on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi at the time. After having spent half of my life to that point in Kansas City. Huge societal change, huge upheaval of all of our lives, and the economy in Mississippi at the time, and for a large portion of it still, is just dead. There's just not a lot of opportunity there, not
Sure.
a lot of room for expansion and growth. Certainly, it's an area that's rooted in a lot of racism still to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an uncomfortable place to be. And so I knew I didn't want to stay there. So joining the military for me was kind of a combined act of that extended rebellion from my parents, from my family situation,
Right.
and also a way to get the hell out of a dead-end job. I didn't have money to go to school, and that really I saw as one of the only ways to basically leave and start over somewhere else. So I happened to have just gotten married at the time. My first wife, Pam, is my second wife.
Mm-hmm.
So we both joined at the same time. We both went through basic training and advanced training at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. My first airplane ride, in fact, from Mississippi to South Carolina for basic training. That was an
really?
experience, yeah.
Was that civilian or was it a military flight?
No, it was a civilian flight.
Okay.
Yeah, they give
Okay.
you a ticket to get you there.
Okay.
And interestingly, I hadn't done any research. I hadn't talked to anybody else. Sandy, my first wife, her mother was married to a career Air Force officer.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was that history on her side. She was familiar with it. She was comfortable with it. She knew about military life. But I didn't really talk to him or quiz him or get any advice or suggestions from him. I didn't know anybody else that had gone in, that had come back, that I could have talked with of my own peer group. So I went into this pretty much blind. It was just, I need to get the hell away from here. Let's go there. We'll find out what to do when we get there, right?
Sure.
And interestingly, within the first week at basic training, so the first couple of days, it's all about lots of information, lots of form filling out, lots of physicals, all the prep stuff to get you fully documented to process you in, right? And then they get to the day where they cut all of your hair off. And I had hair down to my shoulders, and
Sure.
and that was a humbling experience, and I knew in that instant that I had made a mistake, that this was not the life for me,
Sure.
that I was not going to fit with this way of being. But I was raised to be a truthful, honest, upstanding person by my parents, and to have a sense of integrity and honesty. And I became that kind of a person where if I say I'm going to do something, I do it, no matter what the cost to me is. Right.
Sure. Uh-huh.
And so, I was like, well, here I am. This isn't where I want to be. This isn't what I want to do. It's only 3 years. Okay, let's go. So I basically just resigned myself to living through the experience and doing it the best that I could. Basic training was, the whole reason that the military trains people the way they do is because they need unquestioning obedience. That's what military, at its core, that's
Sure.
what military structure and hierarchy is all about. They need you not to think, they need you to do in the manner in which you've been trained. And, that takes all kinds of applications and effect of different people's lives, depending on what you do and where you are and what the current world state is and whether we're in conflict or not. But that does not fit with me. I don't operate that
Right,
way, right?
right.
And for some people, it worked. It does click with them. They're perfectly happy being in that kind of an environment, or they're in an occupation within the military that doesn't require them to make or to be in the middle of what potentially could be a moral decision of your life about whether you pull a trigger or whether you push a button to send a bomb or any of those things that are on the one extreme end of why the military exists, right? So I just, like I said, resigned myself to doing the best I could. And then after that, a couple of very lucky things happened to me. One, I happened to have fallen into, picked by choice, the MOS of 76 Yankee, which is supply specialist. And when I landed in Anchorage at Fort Richardson, I happened to have been selected to be in the supply room of the 562nd Engineer Company and in the supply room of Sergeant J. Phillips. He was an E7. He was a Vietnam veteran. He had been a Huey door gunner in Vietnam for 2 tours. He was probably 5'6", 5'7", maybe 110 pounds wet. Feisty guy, full of life, had been through the military hierarchy, up, down, and sideways, and knew it to a T and made it work for him. And I basically became his surrogate son almost, not quite that way, but everybody who worked for him, he took completely under his wing. He totally protected them from all of the potential bullshit that the military organization can throw at people. Yeah. And made it very easy for us to be appreciated, for us to be successful in what we were doing. He was an incredible trainer. And he just believed in looking for and finding good people, teaching them well, treating them well, and taking care of them.
Sure.
And the other thing that worked for us is we were a separate company within the brigade up there. So we were a unique structure of people, probably 100, maybe 150 people, but we were by ourselves in the brigade, so we didn't have to answer to other chains of command. We interacted directly with the brigade command and not with anybody else. Oh, okay. So we had a lot of autonomy within the brigade up there, and because of the way Sergeant Phillips ran his supply room, I had complete autonomy within the company too. So that was real nice. But anyway, we, I told you some of what I didn't like about it, and that was kind of revisited on me periodically. I ascended through the ranks from E1 to E4 as fast as you could within about a year and 2 months, I think. And then the next step was E5, which is sergeant, and that requires another form of basic training. Kind of, you have to go through what they call leadership school, and I just knew that I wasn't going to progress past my 3 years. I didn't see any sense in subjecting myself to further indoctrination, and so I said, I'm done. I'm happy being an E4 until I get out, and that's all I intend to do. So I can be happy there. And luckily, it worked for me because of where I was and because of who I worked for. And one of the things that happened quite often is Sergeant Phillips, because he was very good at what he did, he also taught a lot. So he was away from the unit occasionally during the years on training assignments to other bases throughout the country. And while he was gone, I was in charge. I was the senior guy under him. And when he's gone, I didn't have the effective rank of E7, but I had the respect of his rank within my company. And so that meant that I could exercise the same kind of protection and discipline and care of the people under me in respect to everybody else in the company, officers and non-commissioned alike, that I enjoyed when he was there. Mm-hmm. Which was amazing. That does not happen very often in the military. Yeah. And so I consider myself extremely fortunate that if I had landed, say, in an infantry or an artillery division or company, I really literally would not have made it. And of course, you come to find out later, I did in basic training at the beginning of it when I recognized that I had made a mistake and this wasn't going to be for me. After they assigned us to our companies and introduced us to the drill sergeants, We had a tall, skinny guy. I can't remember his name now. And we had a shorter black woman were our 2 DIs. And she was a fresh sergeant, so she was green and a little more, you could converse with her a little bit more, kind of person to person.
Sure, yep.
And I did at one point tell her, I think this is not going to work for me. I think I made a mistake coming here. And the response that I got back was, you're in, you signed the line, you're done now. Of course, the realization is at that point, it's in the Army's best interest to get rid of somebody if they don't want to be there because they have relatively little money invested in them. No money, no time. They haven't gone through training yet.
Sure.
It's after you've gone through training and gone through a tour or 2 that they really want to keep you, right? So anyway, like I said, I stuck it out and made it to Alaska. Made it through Alaska. The one trick that Sergeant Phillips played on me that I'll never forget. There's, the military and any government bureaucracy, there's a million pieces of paper, a million forms to fill out and sign. And at that point in time in the 80s, there was still carbon paper being used in some things,
yep.
right? And there was I can't remember the form number now, but there was a form that was used for general correspondence. And so it was something that we used almost on a daily basis. It's almost, you don't recognize what it is, And I remember close to the end of my tour when it was about time, a couple of months from leaving, from being discharged, Sergeant Phillips came in with a stack of stuff that I needed to sign. And some of it was for processing out. Some of it was for clearing my personal stuff, the stuff that I'd been issued out of inventory, all that kind of stuff. And so I'm just signing away. And I think nothing more of it. He takes them away. And like a couple of days later, in front of the company, we're having this conversation about something or other. And the subject of me leaving comes up. And he says, "Oh, no, but you extended for another 3 years." I said, "What?" He's fumbling through a bunch of paper that he has, and he had stuck in extension paperwork underneath the form that I was going to sign. It wasn't. It could not have been used. But the blood drained from my face, my heart fell into my stomach, and I just felt like, oh no, what have I done? But he organized and threw an enormous party for me when I got out, and I actually went to work for his wife at the Anchorage Sheraton after I got out in the housekeeping department. She ran the housekeeping department, and I went in as her assistant because it was a place to get a fairly decent job right out of the military. Nothing that I could find in supply at the time. So I went there, and Pam, my wife, likes to say a couple of things over and over just about life in general. And one of them is that your past is what brought you to today. You can't, as much as you might regret or want to change or do something differently,
sure,
it's all a part exactly of where you are in this minute. So there's no sense spending time or energy fretting over it or agonizing over it. If you want to learn something from it, pick that up and go forward. But don't dwell on it. Don't let it, and certainly don't let it continue to influence what you're doing now. And I met her at the Sheraton. So we were both working there, both in management, and hadn't it been for the military, I wouldn't have met her, right? So, we get to these things in our life through a variety of methods and paths and ways and choices and decisions. And it is interesting sometimes to just look back at all of the connections, and sometimes something that may not have been a particularly pleasant part of your past is involved in that path. But you wouldn't be here without having gone through that.
Sure.
And hopefully you learned something from it along the way. So, I look back on it immediately afterwards. Immediately afterwards, I was full of a whole bunch of emotion. It was the still worst thing I'd ever done. I'm so glad I'm out and done with this. And then over the years, I recognize a lot of positive things that I took from it as well. One of them, I alluded to earlier in the Brimfrost story, is it's an incredible thing to be able to put yourself into nature, whether these conditions be extreme or not, and take care of yourself and interact with the world without the benefit of society necessarily being right behind you, right? And it's also then the benefit to find yourself in extreme conditions and know what to do, how to take care of yourself, and how to survive. That's something that a lot of people, especially now, a lot of people, with the disconnect that technology provides us from physical reality, a lot of people are losing their grip on. A lot of people are losing connection with the physical world, how to interact with Mother Nature, how to interact with the earth. And oddly enough, being in the military solidified that for me. Because Alaska, you're in the middle of Alaska. You're in the middle of, you're a 10-minute plane ride away from territory that no person has ever set foot on.
Right.
And 50, 60 degrees below zero. One story about that brimfrost exercise too. I told you that that the temperature can literally kill you, right? So when I was in the military, we were still dealing with Vietnam era equipment and gear, right?
Yep.
And so even in those conditions, we were living in canvas tents. And the tents would have liners on the inside, so they would basically hang a couple of inches away, creating an airspace that would insulate from the outside, right? And in severe conditions, we'd hang a couple of the liners on the inside. But that's it. And so you have to have a heat source going inside these tents 24 hours a day. So they have these sheet metal stoves that look about maybe 8-10 inches square and 2.5 feet long or so. And there's a burner in one end and a flue pipe on the other end. And there's a burner ring inside that's fueled by diesel, because you got to bring diesel for the vehicle. So that's what you burn to keep warm too. And during that exercise, and so the fuel can for the stove is sitting outside on a tripod of posts up off the ground. So it's a gravity drain of the fuel into the stove. During that first week, after we came in and cleared the airstrip so the Air Force could land their people, they came in, set their camps up. At the end of that week was the coldest days during that exercise. And I don't know how many people there were in this tent, but sometime in the middle of the night, the tank outside ran out. They hadn't changed it before they went to bed. Tank ran out. One of the guys inside woke up, recognized what had happened. It was cold, put his gear on, went outside to change it, changed the tank, set it back on, went back inside, lit the stove. The problem was when he went outside and changed the tank, he didn't recognize that the fuel line had frozen solid because fuel wasn't running in it anymore. It was empty.
Sure.
It froze solid because now it was air inside it, not running diesel. During the changing of the tank, the hose developed a crack. And when he put the new tank back up and opened it up, line filled up, gas came out, diesel came out the crack, ran down the rest of the hose inside the tent. He lit the stove, tent blew up, killed him. And, it's
wow.
Unfortunate accident for sure.
Yeah.
But again, hearing about things like that is kind of like watching videos of car crashes for driver's ed class in high school, right? You need to understand the potential extreme consequences of what this is that you're about to take on or do or be in the middle of, right?
Sure.
And when that happened, that was an enormous wake-up call for everybody in the command up there. There was training. The exercise continued. They didn't stop it. They didn't slow it down. But after we got back to base, there was continued training and awareness about that and emphasis put on it. What else? One thing I was incredibly bad at but got incredibly good at was we had, as supply for our company, we had a 2.5-ton dump with a diesel fuel bladder strapped in the back in the bed, the dump body. And we were pulling another fuel tank. So we were the fuel point for our company. While we were out in the woods, our trucks would come fuel up with us. And then when we'd get low, we'd go to wherever usually at the airstrip where the Air Force would flying in bladders of fuel, and we'd refuel our tanks there and go back. And when we would go out into the field to do these exercises, it would literally be in the middle of, I mean, it was on military reservation land, but just a lot of it untracked. And I became really good at driving those 6-wheel drive trucks and backing them in the woods. I had never before driven a vehicle in a trailer, and certainly never backed one. And being able to do it out in the middle of the woods where, you know, you could make a few mistakes and not wreck your dad's car, taught me a lot about handling vehicle and heavy equipment. And I got to play around with all the stuff we had, the excavators and the dozers and the graders. And it was there were a lot of good, positive things that I can remember in the moment. And I really did, I think probably why they stick out so much for me is because I was focusing on them rather than giving negative energy to the thought of where I was, how much time I had left, why I was still there, because I could certainly have turned my attention the other way, right? But I think I remember the good times more because that was where my focus was. I was looking to find enjoyment out of whatever I could while I was there, and, you know, continued to recognize that I was in a really good position and was very lucky to have landed there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Especially nowadays with so much of the conflict that's happening going on in the desert.
Yeah.
I at least don't think of, you know, cold weather operations, but back then we were definitely still somewhat in the Cold War mindset, weren't we?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And the whole northern operations in Siberia or whatever,
right.
Potentially.
Yep.
Yeah. You said it was a 3-year contract. Was that? I think nowadays it's maybe 4 or 6. Was 3-year a common?
3-year was the minimum at the time I signed up.
Okay.
After I signed up, there was a period of time when it went down to 2, and that just kind of like, you know, twisted the knife for me.
Right.
But
I could have been.
That's right. I could have been halfway done by now. But then it went back up to 3, and yeah, I don't know, you know, where it is right now. Like you say, it could be multiple years. I do know that one of our renters is a Navy family out of the off the, I think whatever it is, off the Nimitz, yeah, and the military treats and pays their people a hell of a lot better now than they did in the 80s.
Sure.
They're better equipped. The gear is better. Everything about, from the service member's perspective, I think everything got substantially better. The risk also got substantially larger, however, right? With the conflicts that were in. When I was in the military, there was no conflict. There was no armed conflict anywhere in the world for us. And it was, you know, in being in the military during peacetime is a cakewalk, relatively speaking. You still have to deal with the hierarchy. You still have to deal with I'll call it brainwashing, or I don't want to call it mind control, but there's not a great word for that.
Sure, I mean there's a hive mind. You know, there's definitely a consistency that they want.
Exactly.
In your viewpoint.
Yes, you still have to deal with that, but without the risk of deployment, conflict, and possible death hanging over you on a daily basis. It was a pretty easy gig, relatively speaking, right? So that was the other thing that I was very lucky about, was when I went in. Not only how and who I ended up with, but when I went in, too, was a major a benefit for me. I think probably if there had been conflict, or if conflict had arisen that would have required me to deploy to an active area, I think I probably would have ended up in jail. I don't think I would have gone.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And that's from the benefit of hindsight. And, you know, I'm sitting here 40 years after the fact, but I think it was I'll call it the self-preservation bent in me was strong enough at the time that I would have refused to go.
Sure. And knowing the cost would have been, probably AWOL or jail.
It would have been,
whatever, for
court-martial. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, and then that they like to tell you that dishonorable discharge from the military will ruin your life.
Mm-hmm.
It really doesn't. When I got out of the Army, to this day, never once have I been asked if I was in military service as a interview for any position that
sure.
I've ever applied for. Never once has that come up. Trying to remember. I get asked more now when I go check out at Lowe's or Home Depot.
Right.
Right. It's just a lot different.
I wonder if maybe that is more common for people, say 20 years your junior, to be asked that
sure.
when they apply for
Sure.
something.
I'm sure that's the case. Yeah,
because
and also, like I said, there's less stigma, I think, these days. There's certainly issues with the segment of combat troops that come back that have PTSD and that have to adapt and deal with that. There's certainly a stigma that goes along with that.
Sure.
But I think for most of the remaining people in the military coming out and going into civilian life, I think there's a lot more regard held for that background, for that experience now than there used to be. Certainly than there was right before my generation with people coming out of Vietnam.
Sure.
Right. But I think that just the public mindset has changed substantially from then till now. One of the things Pam and I were talking about earlier was, let's see if I can reconstruct the question or the issue. Now I'm going to lose it. Maybe it'll come back to me. Sorry. It was a comparison between of the world condition between now and when I was in the military, and I'll think of it in a minute.
Oh, sure, yeah, we're definitely in a different place. I mean, the military's different, the culture's different.
Yep.
Our place in the country's place in the world is different, for sure.
Yep. Yeah.
So that's true. And I'm definitely looking for that large viewpoint, not just veterans from the global war on terror, but also just the larger view,
right?
Historical as well as current.
Yeah.
So
well, I one of the questions, your questions for the interview itself was, what advice would you give to someone else thinking of entering military life?
Yeah.
That's a tough question to answer. For me, like any other career or experience or anything that I've gone through, for me to convey that to somebody else, a couple of caveats there. One, my experience is my experience. Being in the military or any other occupation will be unique to every individual. Their experience will be unique to them. And because the military experience is so, or can be so distinctly different from civilian life, right? You're in civilian life. You move from job to job. Your time away from the 8 hours a day that you spend for your job is consistent through that. In the military, it's not. It's completely different. You're pretty much on the clock 24 hours a day. They can call you back anytime they want to, and you have to go.
Right.
But because that experience is so unique for every person, I don't think it would be fair for me to offer advice of, you should do this, you should do that. Number one, you would need to know intimately the person you're giving that advice to understand whether or not, in your opinion, the military life and their mentality, their morality, their way of thinking, their way of acting and living would jive or not, or would be in conflict, like it was for me, right? And then the other part of it is, now that I am 40 years on the other side of my decision and my time in the military, I certainly have a whole almost lifetime's, generations worth of perspective that I've gained that loads my memory of my time in the military, right? I know people in my life and in my past for whom being in that type of an environment and basically following the directive and being in that kind of a structured environment, both at work and out of work, they were perfectly suited for. They joined early, they put their time in, they retired at 35 or whatever 38, and now they've got half of their adult life to do something else. Mm-hmm. It's like a clean slate, right? I regret not having that opportunity. I regret not having that ability to basically start over at 38 or 40 and reinvent myself again.
Sure.
Right? That's a cool thing. That's one really good pro to it. But for me, that did not outweigh the con for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I could sit down and talk to someone like I'm doing to you about my experience in the military, but I would be loath to advocate or not one way or the other for their participation in it. What I would say is what I regret that I didn't do. What I would say is do exactly what this podcast is doing. I would go talk to everybody you can find that's been in the military, read everything you can read, not fiction, but nonfiction from people that have served, and educate yourself. Find out what the practicality of that decision really means to you. And then what you have to do is you also have to consider that you may go into the military single. You may not end up single very long. You may not stay single very long.
Sure.
And as I think Pam gave you a few of her perspectives on being an Army brat for her entire childhood, for her youth, a family being in the military, the family bears as much burden and stress and unease, and they bear all of the negative things that the service member does too, and they have no say in it, right? They're just basically along for the ride. They can stay or they can leave. They can stay in the relationship with that service member or they can leave. That's the only decision that they have. Otherwise, the service member is gone. If there's deployment happening, he's gone for 6 months, 8 months, a year, right? And you just don't see him. And quite often, they come back altered. They come back as slightly different personas of who they were when they left you. And I think that potential is not explored very often by people who are making a decision to enter military life. Unless they're already married, unless they come from a military family and they have participated in it already, I think very few people understand that if I sign up for 6 years, 8 years, my family's signing up. They basically are signing along the dotted line right underneath me. Mm-hmm. And that's something to consider. That's not insignificant by any stretch. So that would be my spiel to somebody, is just educate yourself and look down the road as much as you can and consider everything that you can for yourself and your potential family before you decide what to do. But that's, to larger or smaller degree, that's a decision process that we all should undergo when contemplating a major change in our lives, right? You look at and you weigh the pros and the cons. You look down that road as far as you can. You look down the alternate roads as far as you can. You make a decision. Nothing's ever irreversible. I'll say that, and you can quite often find a lot of joy and happiness in the midst of trying circumstances.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the one of the best things that my time in the military did for me was I was lucky enough to be in supply, and again, I have no memory. I think probably you have to do an aptitude test before you join. At least you did when I was there, when I joined. So you do this at this Armed Forces Vocational Aptitude Test or something, and that may have pointed them to supply as an option to give me. It was the top of the option. I remember that. It was the choice. There was a list of here's what we think you'll be good at. It was at the top, so that's the one that I took. That really, I think, saved me, because it put when you're in supply, everybody else in your unit is beholden to you. You control. You're the bottleneck of everything, right?
Yep.
And that's a good position to be in. And so it put me in that. And kind of unknowingly to me at the time, it helped solidify a bunch of character traits that I had for organization, keeping track of paperwork, managing physical items, just everything about the supply and logistics operation of an enormous complex web like the military is. It was like plugging right into the Borg. Yeah, seriously, it was that easy for me to manage and work their process. It was so easy to me. It was like second nature.
Sure.
And it reinforced that for me, and I think that has served me from that day till today. That ability to hone those skills and even find and identify them to myself, and then to be able to really get good at them and perfect them before I had to go out and use them to apply for something else, right? I was basically being trained to do this. They were paying me to learn how to do this, and it was something that I was already good at, which was amazing. And that, that has been part of every career move that I've made from then until now. When I got out of the Army, I worked, like I said, at the Sheraton for maybe year and a half. And then I actually was recruited by somebody who knew me, who knew Sergeant Phillips. And I went into the supply room of a oil field services company in Anchorage. And it was like, the nomenclature was different, the forms were different, the process was exactly the same.
Sure.
Here's what you need, here's where you can get it, here's the process of putting it all together and sending it somewhere else. And so, that's probably the biggest benefit that I take, aside from meeting Pam, right? If I hadn't been in the military, I wouldn't have met her. And that's the greatest joy of my life, seriously. But also the ability to kind of find my own vocational aptitudes within myself in the course of that totally unfortunate, unpleasant life choice that I made for 3 years, right? So you got this pearl within the oyster, right? And that pearl has been in my pocket since then. So, you really do, like I said earlier, Pam's thing about looking back is you just have to recognize that it's all part of what puts you in this chair you're sitting in today, and take advantage of it, use it, reflect on it, learn from it, grow it. Don't spend time being pissed about stuff that you would have changed had you had the opportunity,
Yeah, I get the sense that if I was talking to the Delton 5 years after you got out, I might be hearing a little different.
Very different conversation.
The time
yes.
has kind of allowed you to consider the situation and apply it and see, as you said, see the benefits that you gained,
right?
Even in spite of the downsides.
Yep, that's a fact, and that's that should be the case for every adult at every point in their life. We should find ourselves with greater compassion, greater knowledge, greater aptitude, greater reflection on our past selves, wherever we find ourselves in the present, hopefully having grown slightly from every one of those events that was positive or negative that helped us to get to where we are. It's just part of being alive.
You mentioned your relationship with Sergeant Phillips and how that helped you in the military. Kind of a two-part question. After you got out, did that relationship continue? And then also, did you form other bonds that maybe did or did not continue later?
So Sergeant Phillips, I got out. He was still in. He had, I think, a year or a year and a half maybe left before he retired. He was ready to retire, so that was another factor in kind of his mindset about how he treated, how he took care of himself and his people was,
he's getting out. He doesn't care.
One foot's out the door already, right? Not that he didn't care, but that he was determined to make his exit as graceful and as easy on him and his people as he could. After I got out, I was still in Anchorage. He was still in Anchorage until he retired. We did stay in touch fairly frequently for 6 months or so, and that got less and less. And then he went for a 6-month TDY as temporary duty. He went for a 6-month TDY down to the States here somewhere, and then I moved from the hotel to the oilfield services company, and contact was less after that. And then I did organize a party for him at his retirement when he got out. So we got together for that, and then he and his wife moved back down to the west coast of Florida, where they were from.
Okay.
And I had a couple of phone calls. I'm trying to remember, there was something else, some other contact. I can't remember what the reason for it was now. But yeah, that was it. Yeah, I mean, he. It is kind of interesting. I think it may be a function of how old you are when you are in the military. But for me, the relationships that I formed and participated in high school are cemented in my brain. You know, that kind of formative years when you're coming to experience and know all the human emotions that a person goes through. Your hormones are raging. You know, you're going through this completely transformative process of getting thrown into different groups of people over and over and over.
Right.
It does something about the relationships that you experience during that time. Just stick with you in your mind, at least, whether they do or not, don't physically. Military was like that for me to some degree. I look back on my time with him very fondly, and he did too. But we were at the core, we were very different people. He was a fairly conservative guy. I discovered during that process and in the rest of my life since then that I lean more to the left. And so we didn't have, aside from the military, we didn't have a whole lot in common. You asked if there were other relationships. So my other most valuable relationship, I think, in the military was as the separate company, we had our own motor pool that took care of all of the vehicles we used. And the motor pool was run by a warrant officer. So in the military, I'm not sure in the Air Force, but in the Army, there's non-commissioned people who enlist. There are commissioned officers who enlist and then go through officer training school. And there are warrant officers. I'm not exactly clear on the difference between warrant officers and commissioned officers, to be honest with you. But the warrant officers were typically in charge of helicopters, maintenance, not typically in charge of companies of people. Right, they weren't field commands. Sure. They were other types of commands. Anyway, I'll go to the grave with this memory. The first day, so I was processing into the unit. I'm totally green. I have no idea what to expect coming into this environment. I'm still kind of literally shell-shocked from the whole episode of basic training and my advanced training, and now another long airplane flight from South Carolina to Anchorage, stopping here in Seattle. And first couple of days I'm there, I'm just walking around completely clueless. And I'm in the supply room one day with Sergeant Phillips and two other guys that were also in the unit with us in the supply room. And in comes this kind of big, bulky, gruff-looking guy. He's got old-style fatigues on. So at that point, when I was in, they were just going into the camouflage pattern. But you could wear the camouflage or you could wear the old OD green ones.
Oh, okay.
And of the old OD green ones, there was even an older style that was like Vietnam-era style that was stitched and sewn differently, and they were still okay to wear. And that was like the cool badge of uniform
I've been around.
to wear. I've been around, right. Or I've got a connection, don't mess with me. Right. And so he comes in with that, boots that you could have shaved in, and I see the insignia on his collar. Warrant officers have bars with squares on them. Number of squares denotes which warrant rank you are.
Okay.
And when an officer walks into a room, non-commissioned people are supposed to salute, or at least come to attention. I come to attention and I salute. He walks over and smacks me in the chest as hard as he can. knocks the breath out of me, knocks me back on my ass on the floor. I fall down on the floor. He says, "Don't you ever call me sir or salute me. I work for a living, goddammit." He said, that's what he said to me. And then he came over and he helped me up and he patted me on the back and he said, "I'm just giving you a hard time. My name's Chuck Watkins. I'm in charge of your motor pool. We're going to be really good friends." And every word of that turned out to be true.
That's awesome.
He, even more than Sergeant Phillips, he treated me like a son that he had never had. He and his wife had never had any kids, and they were, in retrospect, as it turns out, they were also fairly conservative, right-wing type people. And he was into guns a lot, but he would literally give the shirt off of his back to someone in need. He was the most genuinely honest person I think that I can remember in my life, in my history of people. And I stayed in touch with him even after I got out, more than with Sergeant Phillips. He was a big outdoor enthusiast. He and Betty was his wife. They would buy new snow machines like every other year, and so I ended up buying 2 snow machines from him for myself, and Pam got to ride on one once. And so I would go on adventures with those guys on snow machines periodically. He built a house north of Anchorage, and he buried a 12-foot diameter culvert in the ground in the basement level of his house that was dug back into the dirt, into the earth horizontally.
Okay.
And it was a shooting range. He set up a target at the far end with a pulley retrieval system. He reloaded all of his own ammunition. I mean, but he wasn't rabid about it.
Sure.
He was very practical and very matter of fact, but
kind of self-sufficient, or
not even that. He just liked having guns around him and interfacing with weaponry.
Okay.
He did not have any. He might have had a semi-automatic. He did not have any automatic weapons. He was not on that train, the train that you see today. He was not on that train. He was just it was part of his background, his growing up. He was around guns from when he was a little kid. He was very comfortable with them. They were just part of his life. Both he and Betty were marked sharpshooters. They were excellent shots. And so I go over there and shoot a box of shells at targets with him all day, one day. So after I got out, he retired. He actually retired before I did, 6 months or so. They stayed in Alaska. And then after I kept in touch with him for most of the time that I was still up there. When I moved down to Seattle, he developed pancreatic cancer and died within 6 months of the diagnosis. Just like that. Yeah. So they don't know what the cause was. They don't know what brought it on. It was frighteningly fast, and he was gone. I did have good relationships with a couple of people, a couple of the guys in my unit. One of them was a communication specialist who was a Mexican dude from California, Carlos Gutierrez, and he and I roomed together for some part of the time in the dorm. So to fill in gaps in the story, I was married when I went to Alaska in the Army. Within the first year, she and I divorced. It was a relationship that was not meant to be. We got married when we were 18. It was, stupid decision, get married, stupid decision, potentially go into the military, right? It's that, when you're 18, your brain is not fully formed. It's a medical fact. Yeah. So it's hard to make good decisions. At any rate, we got divorced within the first year, and for a period of time after we were divorced, I had to live in the barracks. When single people usually have to live in the barracks. Sure. If you have an independent source of income, you can live what's called on the economy. You can live out. You can go get an apartment in town if you want to. But certain people have to live in the barracks, and I didn't have money, so I lived in the barracks. And so in the barracks, it's almost always at least 2 people to a room. So, I went from being married and living with my wife in an apartment to having to share a room in a dorm situation. Right. You have a bathroom in your room, but you can't have a hot plate. You can't have a microwave. and it's like a college dorm room with 2 bunk beds in it. I mean, it's
Yeah.
you know, that was a stretch too.
Luck of the draw in your roommate.
That's right. That's
at
exactly
best.
right. That's exactly right. So fortunately, when I was first there and had to be with somebody else, it was with Carlos, and he became one of my very best friends during that time that I was in there. And then a couple of months after that, the size of the company shrunk, and we happened to be in a very large building with lots of rooms. I was able to get a room by myself. And I was able to bring a queen-size bed into that room, get rid of the bunk beds, and it started to be better. And I was able to live that way until I got out.
Sure.
So that helped a lot.
Give you kind of a feeling of individualism,
Yes.
even in the midst
A
of
little more autonomy.
Yeah.
You can control, and that's what it becomes about, right? It's you lose control of your environment and your surroundings in the military to a large degree.
Sure.
And that was a way of getting some of it back. Was just I could take care of this, 14 by 20 foot space and put what I wanted to in there. It didn't have to look a certain way. It just had to be neat and clean and tidy. So that was one way of fighting back against the man, against the system, I guess. I don't know.
I'm curious if you agree with this. This especially back in that day, I've heard somebody that was in more recently referred to being in the military, compare it to living in the DMV 24/7. The bureaucracy.
Yes.
element.
Yeah.
Was that
Yes.
the case
yes.
back then?
Definitely. Yeah. There's you don't go anywhere, you don't do anything without it. When you're on the clock, when you're at your quote unquote work, at your job, right? Nothing spontaneous. Nothing is done without being planned and fully documented and all of that background. I think I heard a statistic somewhere. I should have written it down. I think it was when I was driving. One combat soldier that is that's at the front lines, right? That's pointing the gun at the enemy, right? Behind him, it was a weird number of like 400 or 500 people in the immediate combat support.
Sure.
To support that one person. Behind those people, there's 5,000 or 6,000 people for everyone, and those can be military and civilian.
Okay.
Back there,
sure.
right? There's a lot of huge civilian employee workforce for the military too. But where was I going with this now, Steve? What was your question?
I'm stuck too.
I can't remember what you just asked me now.
Living in the DMV.
Oh, the bureaucracy.
of it, yeah.
So that, I was in that rank back, the first rank back, and it's enormous. The just learning the paperwork processes necessary to go to a supply house off base, because so I was in charge. I was in supply, right? So the government has supply channels for military, certainly for all the military gear that they issue to you. But there's tons of non-military gear that they depend on the local economy for. Toilet paper, all the stuff that's necessary to keep domestic life running on a base. It doesn't all come from the military supply channels. You go out on the economy, is what they called it, and you get a lot there. Just the paperwork necessary to go do a supply run into town was staggering. It became routine after a while, and you get used to it, and you get used to the process. But it's certainly, I can't think of a comparable civilian career other than the DMV. That's a good analogy, where there's so little left to personal initiative. I have a good story for you.
Sure.
So during the time that I was there, towards the end, after Brimfrost 83, so this would have been mid to late 83 or early 84, the Army issued a new tracked vehicle to the brigade that I was in Alaska. So before that, all we had was wheeled trucks. Literally, that's what we had to take everybody out into the field. Infantry, artillery, engineers, everybody. It was all wheeled vehicles.
Sure.
So they introduced this articulated 2-piece, 2-cab, articulated 4-track device, a piece of equipment.
Like an Arctic Cat or
like
something,
an Arctic,
kind of? Or what, I'm not sure what they call it.
Kind of like a, yeah, but I mean, you've seen what they groom ski runs with,
sure,
right?
Sure.
Big, pretty wide tracks on it. So a cab up front where the driver sat, where the engine was, with 2 tracks, then articulated to a box in back that could be extremely flexible. You could take the top off of it. It'd be like a pickup truck. Had its own set of tracks that was driven, so the engine drove both sets of tracks. You could haul equipment in it. You could haul personnel in it. You could do all kinds of stuff in it. They were issuing these to replace a bunch of Jeeps and some of the lighter duty trucks to the various units. So Chief Watkins, our motor pool officer, after he retired from active duty, he came back to work as a civilian employee in charge of the biggest motor pool on base that took care of all of the vehicles that some of the civilian employees used, some of the office people, some of the command staff, the cars and pickups and that kind of stuff. Not the equipment that the units had. They had their own motor pool. So he was in charge of a bigger motor pool, and he was running it. And it fell on that motor pool to put these vehicles together, these tracked vehicles. They shipped them in on rail cars from the lower 48. He took the crates off, and it was his job to put them together and then issue them out to the units. I think the first shipment that he got in, he finished in I don't remember the exact numbers, but I'm going to provide an analogy. If they gave him 10 units and they said, you've got 4 months to assemble and send these out to the units, he did it in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And his hands got slapped for doing that. And that was the trigger for him to say, okay, then find somebody else to do this. I'm not going to do bad work or slow and lazy work just because you can't bring them in fast enough or whatever. Find me something else to do. I'm going to put these together the best way that I know how and efficiently, and I'm going to get them out so these people can use them and start training with them. I'm not going to sit on my thumbs just because you say it needs to take me 4 months to put together 10 vehicles. And that was his kind of epiphany after all of his time. He was able at that point to say, sorry, see you, find somebody else.
Sure.
He didn't have to stick it out because he was out. But that was a good kind of just a reality check moment for me too, when I saw him do that, and that was right before I was going to get out too. And it just helped solidify the decision that I knew I already was making, which was I needed to get back and get in total charge of my life again, and basically start my slate clean again to find out what it is that I wanted to do and move on from there. Yeah.
Did I don't know if this is the case now even, but being married, did that give you any authority over your posting? Because you would be posted together.
We had the choice of picking our MOS, our specialty, or picking our first duty station. We had that choice. We picked our MOS.
Oh, okay.
We got chosen Alaska. A good choice. I got Alaska is considered overseas duty, so I got extra pay for being there, even though it's in the United States. The economy is because of the economy. Cost of living is higher up there. The only other benefit that it gave me was because we were married, we could live off base. So we got we rented an apartment in Anchorage, and so we didn't have to live in a dorm or in there is housing on base that you can apply for. Up there happened to not be a lot of it. It was full. There was a waiting list, so we went out in town and got an apartment, and that was a way better setup. Yeah. That was the benefit for me. The other benefit, of course, was that she was in the Army too. So all the things that I alluded to earlier about the impact of family on someone's decision to go into the military didn't apply because she was in the same situation.
In the same commitment.
Yeah. And she, even though our relationship was doomed and separated, she felt about it the same way that I did. She I found out later she had been looking at it, didn't tell me this at the time when we made the decision to go in. She had been looking at it the same way that I was. This is just my ticket to get me out of here and away from my mother.
Sure.
There was that I didn't
Sure.
know. And get her to a place where she felt more able to make decisions on her own. She got out after her 3-year term to move back to Kentucky where she was from, and don't know what happened to her after that.
Sure. Yeah. You definitely talked about how the ways that you were helped. That looking back, what you gained from it. And maybe the brimfrost is the answer to this. But what is, when you look back, what's the one experience of your time in the military that really sticks out the most? That's the most memorable, I guess.
Like a physical experience.
Yeah. Not the overall
right
time, but a moment or a day or something in your time.
I think brimfrost does. This particular one in 1983, just because of the extreme temperature, right?
Sure.
I can't remember now if brimfrost was every year or every other year. I can't remember that, but I participated in at least 2 that I know of. The other one was a much milder winter, was a piece of cake as compared to that one. So, that one sticks out in my mind for the reasons that I said before, which is just that you're in such a harsh environment, and you have to pay attention to the rules, and you have to know what you're about. Step outside to go pee in the snow, and literally freezes before it hits the ground. That's pretty sober. It's funny, but it's pretty sobering too.
Yeah.
Literally, you expose flesh. You take a glove off. You walk outside the tent. You get everything on before you step outside the tent. Unzip 5 flaps. Go out. Zip 5 flaps back down. Turn around. You can't breathe. It's not only do the nose hairs in your nose freeze, your lungs are having an enormous task of converting that air that's at 75 degrees below zero to your body temperature. Your body temperature, hot goes to cold, right? That's the law of thermodynamics.
Right.
Heat goes to cold. Your body is trying to give up its heat to that outside. That's why you put all the clothes on. You can't control. You can filter it. You can wear a balaclava or something, right? But what happens then is you just form ice crystals because that breath is moisture, and it freezes immediately when it comes out of the balaclava. The ice, you can't breathe through ice. So sooner or later, that's an impediment. And that's within the first 15 seconds of stepping outside the tent. This realization comes to you, right?
Yeah.
Now you turn around, now you realize, okay, well, if I'm going to go, I either have to go through this long trek over hill and dale to get to our chemical decontamination unit where the portable toilets are, or there's a tree right there and I can go pee right there. But in order to do that, you got to expose some flesh because you got to open your clothes and take a zipper down.
Right.
And just taking a glove off at 70 below zero in about 30 seconds is extremely painful. And it's you take the glove off, you open your parka, you take the glove off inside your parka, you get your hand as warm as you can, you go quick and you bring it right back in, you warm it back up, put it back in. But just something that easy, something that you take for granted under normal circumstances, at an extreme, becomes not life. Well, could become life or death.
Sure.
At that exercise, because of the extreme temperatures, they modified guard duty. So when you go out on these exercises, again, they treat it like you're in conflict. So they set up a perimeter, they set up wire, they set up dummy mines and devices, and so your encampment is completely protected, and everybody in the unit has to spend some time out on the line on guard duty. And I was not immune to that. Everybody, including the commanding officer, was doing that. So nobody was ever allowed to go out on guard duty by themselves. It had to be at least 2 people.
Sure.
And there was always somebody who was in charge of the guard, was always constant motion checking stations. So nobody was ever left alone more than 5 or 10 minutes, whatever it took to do a circuit around. That was just constant all the way. I got to a point a couple of times because you would go out into, you're operating in a forest environment where the snow is maybe 4 or 5 feet deep. And you go out and you basically carve yourself a little position in a snowbank, kind of like make a little snow fort.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're smart, you do like the indigenous people that live in that environment do, which is create a very small entrance device on the leeward side, wherever the wind is blowing.
Sure.
And create the space inside, because snow is an excellent insulator. And so you try to protect yourself as much as you can that way, even if you're only going to be out there for half an hour, because being in that temperature, even with all your gear on for half an hour, is about all you can do. And then everybody would rotate out and take their turns. That experience is probably one of the strongest from my time up there, just because of that extreme that we had to operate in. Yeah, it was educational.
So obviously in any job or whatever, there's tensions and inter issues and whatever.
Yep. During
that exercise, what was the effect of the exercise and the need to work together, the danger, I guess, that you're in? How did that affect your interrelationship tensions in the office, not the office, but in the unit?
Yeah.
Did it help?
I think it's probably good and bad. There's, like you said, there's conflict in every work environment to some degree, especially when you're talking about 100 or 150 people. There's a lot of different personalities there.
Yeah.
Everybody's got to work together to some degree and get along. And I just remembered, I think it's coming back to me, what I was trying to remember earlier. I think I can come back to it. Those conflicts are either exacerbated or mitigated by extreme circumstance, typically, right?
Okay,
so,
sure.
So when you're in that environment, everybody's in that environment, everybody's at the same risk. Everybody does pull together a little bit more. Everybody helps each other a little bit more when you're in conflict like that, I found. It tended to exacerbate the bad tendencies of the people that were just lazy, no good pieces of garbage anyway, right?
Okay,
They were the ones that would try to shirk guard duty. They were the ones that would, miraculously stub their toe or sprain their ankle or whatever and not have to go do A, B, or C. Everybody else, and that was really a very small percentage of people. Everybody else, by and large, really did become more cohesive and work together, I found. If I can piece it together now, I think the attitude about making the decision to go into the military present day, where there is armed conflict as a very real consequence of that decision.
Sure.
Compared to when I went into the military and made my decision in peacetime, when there really was nothing like that hanging over my head.
It was a high-level civilian conservation corps. Or
exactly
something.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that is one of the enormities of what anyone now contemplating that decision also has to think about, right? Is that that's such a volatile part of that decision is you don't know what the world situation is going to be like literally from day to day. It can change in the space of a day.
Sure. And
your life can be impacted in the space of a day to the degree over which you have no control. Right? You can say, no, I'm not going to participate, lock me up, put me in a jail cell, and that's
at a high cost.
That's the only option, right?
Yeah.
High cost to you, yes, physically, emotionally, professionally, financially, every way. And I think that that may be one of the practical realities of military life that people who haven't been around it have a hard time comprehending. That once you commit yourself legally to that length of term of service for the government, for the military, you relinquish an enormous portion of your self-control. Enormous portion of your self-control.
Sure.
So much that you don't even, it's all that stuff you take for granted just living as a civilian. I want to move to California next year. Sorry.
Yeah.
I want to go take a vacation in a month.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that you got to plan that stuff a long time in advance in the military, and all the little day-to-day stuff too.
I wonder what I'd look like in a beard.
Right.
You're going to have to wait.
That's right. I would save up the 3 years that I was in. I saved up all of my leave. I didn't take any vacation. I saved it all up, and I took a month at a time. And I would go back home and visit my family in Mississippi for a month, let my hair grow out, let all my facial hair grow out. It just basically turned off the military, or tried to turn it off, and deal with being a civilian again for a month, and then go back. Yeah, but what I'm getting at is that the seriousness of the potential consequence to being in the military, and again, it solely depends on what you're doing. There are a lot of positions in the military that people can go into that even in times of conflict, unless that conflict happens to be in the United States, will never put themselves close to being in harm's way. But there's a large chunk of people that are in that front and immediate behind contingent of support that are the ones that end up as casualties in conflict. And I don't know, that's for me, that would probably be my strongest argument against it, and that's only because of the strong personal commitment that I have to life. Right? I don't take life lightly. The fact that I am alive here, that I am blessed with who I am, where I am, what I am, how I've been able to get here, I think about consciously a lot. And if I was 18 or 20 years old, obviously I don't have that perspective that I do at 62. Right? I don't have that bank of knowledge, of understanding of the world and myself to draw on before I make this decision. But for people that are listening to this and are anticipating or contemplating an entry into military life, again, I say educate yourself, educate yourself, educate yourself. And part of that education should be talking to older people, not only people of your age group or your peers that have been or who are in the military, but older people that have been in the military too. Get a wide variety of experiences and talk to them about their daily life. Talk to them about what it means, during the course of performing their job, as opposed to being in civilian life and doing something similar. That perspective is hard to gain from the outside, but that perspective is what quite often makes or breaks it for somebody once they're there, once they're in the situation, whether or not they can handle that method of being and method of living and method of control, or whether that's going to grate on them. And, I saw a lot of people turn to alcohol and drugs as a way of compensating because they didn't get along, because it was a huge strain on them, and that was their method out. They couldn't leave. They didn't want to end up in jail. They didn't have a lot of other options. They get drunk every night or every weekend for sure. And that's a sad fact that continues to happen to this day too, I'm sure. I am encouraged by, like I said earlier, the value placed on military service by the general public, and it seems to me by the U.S. government and by each branch of the service at large also now. I think they take care of their people better. I think there's much more support for what would previously have been termed wussy issues, or people would have been looked down on for looking for help for a mental health issue before now is much more commonplace, much more accepted, recognized as what it is, which is that that's part of the human condition and that everybody needs to be treated for it, not ostracized for it. That kind of thing was unthinkable in my day in the military, right? And so, I'm encouraged that the people that I see in the military now, I think, are probably benefiting from a much better organization from some of those aspects of the organization. They're still subject to the rigidity, to the hierarchy, to all of that control. That's still part of it. But I think there's probably a lot more mitigating circumstances to help smooth off some of the sharp edges of that life for them. I hope.
Yeah. That I've definitely observed that it's you think of like World War II, where it was considered shell shock and, like you say, just not accepted.
Right.
Whereas now it's more people are recognizing the difference is, like you say, everybody experiences that. It's the noticeable difference is some people can suppress it, and some people are less able to for whatever reason.
Right.
So that's why you see maybe I've wondered about historically, like World War II, for example, wasn't there that same kind of reaction?
So what Pam and I were talking about earlier, that we were trying to verbally compare the culture of military life from World War II, Korean War era to current day.
Sure.
And the one thing that occurred to me is that, World War II, even Korean War back, the conflict that we found ourselves in, I think, was much more black and white. The country as a whole was more cohesively organized against the enemy, quote unquote. It was a much more readily identifiable conflict. It was happening over there, for sure. And everybody just kind of pulled together for the team and did their part. And there was more pride and camaraderie and feeling of service to your country as a noble ideal during those conflicts, certainly, than ever happened from Vietnam today to present day.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
And that, I think, is a function of the changing world. I don't think it's good or bad. I think it's how we have evolved as a society. The types of conflicts that we find ourselves in now tend to be much messier, a lot more gray area in the reason for the conflict, in the rationale for how it's being conducted, and in why I find myself where I do.
Sure.
It's hard. There is still a outstanding precept of the military that does what I alluded to at the very beginning, which is they have to develop the people that are at the point of that sword have to be developed to still obey without thinking, to act under training without questioning what they're being told to do. And that, while I recognize that that is a necessary implement of a military force being trained against another military force, that the morality that requires people to do that or enables people to do that is not my morality. I can't live that life.
Sure.
I could never be that person. Right. And I can only look on in empathy and concern when I see kids 18 to mid-20s being indoctrinated to that degree of control here in their training, and then moved to a completely foreign location and forced into a conflict that is questionable at best.
Sure.
That for which there are a variety of opinions and reasons and rationales, pro and con. It's not this clear black and white like that World War II was.
Sure,
You don't
sure.
have a Hitler on the other side that is an easy target to fight against and push against. And then find himself in a village with a gun and under the heightened tension of a patrol going through a village. I can't even imagine what that stress is like, right? Coming around a corner and feeling yourself pull the trigger and realizing too late that there's a child on the other end of that bullet, or a civilian on the other end of that bullet, or anything like that.
Sure.
That has to change people. That, and not in a good way. PTSD, I think, is I'm sure even now it's still vastly underreported and vastly undertreated. And I think that a lot of people that may be wholly or partially successful at suppressing how it affects them now once they come back, I think ultimately it's still going to be an enormous impact for the rest of their life, whether they realize it and accept it and deal with it or not. You can't go into that environment and come back as the same person. And, and I think that the recognition of that potential for being in certain parts of the military, I could never do. That would just be anathema to me. I could never, ever do that. And I would, if somebody was contemplating to go be an infantry sharpshooter, that would be my sermon to them. Everything that I've just said would be my sermon to them. But, going hunting and killing a deer is far different, I suspect, than watching another person die at your hands. Yeah. And, it is weird. It's weird. The military exists and conflict exists as long as testosterone is in charge of world societies. And, so there's always the need for what the military was constructed and established to do. It's just not for me. That at the bottom of the day, that's at the end of the day, that's what I come up with. It's just, and it's such a for me, it's such a black and white, cut and dried contrast that as compared to who I am, that it was an easy decision for me from the beginning, and it's one that I've been entirely comfortable with since I got out. I still have a hard time understanding people that volunteer for infantry. It just it boggles my mind. It really does.
Yeah, that's a good perspective to have or to hear. Just like you say, the seriousness of it. It's not a casual.
It's not
casual thing.
It's not, and even my analogy of somebody who comes from a rural background in their life where they've hunted or they've been around, they've used guns in their life, right? It's been a part of their life, right? And they're totally comfortable with it and familiar with it. Pardon me, that wine went down the wrong way. Again, I suspect that it's still the first time that they would have to kill a person. Yeah. A switch flips there, right? Either it's like this, oh my God, what did I just do? Right? Or the opposite of that switch, which in some cases is what the military is all about, right? They want people that are very good at doing that. Sure. And doing that without thinking and doing that when they're told to do that. It's so far beyond my mental ability to comprehend that I can't even get close to putting my mind into what it's like to be inside that person's head at that minute, and then you extrapolate backwards to when that person decided to go into the military. Could they have had any concept of that? No way. Even with that kind of a background, you can't imagine what it would be like to have to kill a person,
Mm-hmm.
whether you believed in the cause or not, right? I think it's still different. And I suspect that same kind of thought process went on with a lot of people in World War II also.
Mm-hmm.
If Hollywood has any bearing in reality in all of its depictions of World War II era conflict, there had to be a lot of self-reflection and regret and what the hell am I doing?
Mm-hmm.
As people were finding themselves at that same trigger point during that conflict too. I think that's not limited to any particular time in society. I think that has to be a universal condition. I think it's my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely sobering. Any final thoughts or anything to mention, promote, or put out there?
No, I mean I could go off on any number of other soapboxes of a variety of issues, but I think where I will leave it is to emphasize what I said several times, which is if the purpose of the podcast is to inform people, if the reason you're doing this is to put information out there so people will have more information when they come to the decision point of whether or not to enter military service, I wholly applaud you for doing that. From that perspective, my final thought would be what I've said a few times, which is educate yourself. Learn everything you can about this potential decision that you're about to make.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to everybody that you can that's been in or that is currently in or has been in, and try to immerse yourself in what real world day-to-day living in the military is like, because that's far and away more of what your experience will be than little incidences, little experiences, even a deployment, right? Depending, but just the day-to-day living within the military hierarchy. Find out what that's like. Really find out what that's like before you decide, and know that if you decide to go and you find out very early on in your training that that's absolutely not what you want to do, don't be afraid to stick your hand up and say, I want out.
Sure.
You can.
Yep.
It will work for you. They don't have a lot of time and money invested in you. It's in their best interest not to have somebody that they're now going to continue to pay money and train who doesn't want to be there. All right? That's not what they're about. They'll give you a lot of grief and they'll make it sound like this is going to be the end of the world for you, but it's not. And if you decide to go in, if that's something that suits your particular characteristics and mindset, I know guys that went in, I know guys that went in at 18 or 19, served their 20 years, retired with a full pension. Now they've got money to do whatever they want to with. And the educational benefits are incredible. You can learn a lot. Try to find a job that's transferable to the civilian economy.
Yeah, sure.
Flying drones to kill people, hard to bring that outside.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yep.
Yeah, that's really about it for me. It was good. It was bad. Overall, it was just part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
It was a integral part. It was a transformative part. Lots of change. But now, 40 years beyond it, I can look back and, like you said, I can reflect positively and negatively. Overall, it was just part of my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. It didn't mess me up forever. Didn't help me. Part of it helped me forever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly part of it helped me to this day.
Yeah, awesome.
And hopefully you can say that about everything that's in your past, right?
Sure.
That there were good things and bad things about it, but overall I was able to take something out of it that I carry with me now. And I don't think you can ask for anything more. I think that's what life has to be built on.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for your time.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
it.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of How I Embraced the Suck. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend. And as my Girl Scout den mother used to say, stay frosty.
No, that's okay because editing is 95% of this.